start off is we want to find some major points on this drawing that we start putting on this paper. And we do that by actually physically measuring out distances on here, and then we transfer the distance over here. So let's just start things off by putting that measurement over here. And you know, we always want to check that. So we might actually take the measurement from here and see if it matches over on the drawing. Maybe this is a bit subtle, but I can see I'm about 2 millimeters too high. And let's erase the first mark. And now it's looking a bit more like this. And now we have our first mark, which is the point where this pedestal that the statue is on is intersecting the plumb line. So we have a pretty strong point there. Yeah, so we just keep measuring important bits like this. Maybe the second point could be where this cast intersects our plumb line over here. And we just keep measuring like this. And you're gonna have to guess a little bit. I think I put the mark a little bit lower than I was supposed to, so I just lift it up visually a little bit. This isn't, you know, absolutely precise, so we have to actually visually compare as well. Yep, it's a little bit too low. So we just do it like that. Well, for marks like this, where there is a very clear distance that we're aiming for, we can obviously just eyeball it and then check. We don't have to, you know, first measure and then put the mark down. We can do it the opposite way. We can put a mark down and then measure. So that might be a little bit faster. And before you stop watching the video, I know this way is very tedious, but it will allow you to actually physically check things quite accurately from the drawing to the drawing we're comparing to. And that is important, so you can actually objectively compare your drawing to the plate here. And you know, we have something that is, maybe we place a line over here and we think it's this edge over here, and now we can actually objectively compare from this to this, and oh no, it's, you know, way too narrow, so we actually have to push this out, and we don't have to guess at all when we're doing that. You can do that similarly with, you know, measuring with a knitting needle or something like this, and you know, that gets us in the similar ballpark. But we're not going to be measuring the other projects with a string like this, but we do it with the Bargue for one reason, and this is, you know, my own reason for doing this. We did it at school like this, but no one really explained why we do it like this. There are other ways to do the Bargue as well. So the reason for me, at least, is that we get, you know, very objective, accurate measurements, so that when we try to use this drawing to actually train our eyes to see shapes, to see values, all this kind of stuff, we can actually trust that our drawing is objectively correct in here, because we have actually measured things out, you know. We can compare directly. We're absolutely certain, you know, whatever measurement we're going for is correct. So the problem must be elsewhere. So maybe it is, you know, a shape that is looking wrong, and it's not actually that, you know, something is too tall or wide. So that is the reason we do it like this, just for this project. Also, if you do the second advanced Bargue for that project as well, I recommend you do this. Now, if you absolutely hate this way of working, there are plenty of other Bargue tutorials out there. You can use another method, but you know, just I wanted to give you my reasons for doing it like this. So, okay, let's get back and check this point. And a double check, triple check if you need to. My point was a little bit too high. And let's move it back. So sometimes our eye lies to us. Maybe our initial thought was a little bit off, and all we need to do is we just, you know, fix it. And it doesn't take long. Yeah, so that's pretty close. So I'm not going to talk over each and every measurement. This is just a demonstration. So what I'm going to do next is I will start mapping out, you know, important points, like maybe this one, maybe, you know, this very clear point over here, and we just simplify these into straight lines. We will then, you know, start refining things, but first we just want to put something that we can actually look at and compare to over here. Yeah, so let's actually do one more measurement on the plumb line over here, and that will be this point over here where, you know, the back kind of, well, the back muscles kind of go in and the lower back starts kind of pushing outwards. So we have a pretty good strong point there as well. So let's see, you know, the longer the measurement, the closer it's gonna be on the first time, because, you know, percentage wise it's a little bit, it's gonna be a lot closer. But, you know, a millimeter matters in this stuff, so do try to take care. My initial mark was a little low, so let's just lift it slightly. So yeah, and some people will actually tell you, you know, you make an envelope kind of shape. You start by making large straight lines and then carve in from there. That's a good way as well. But yeah, let's just do it like I was taught, and then you will know the other approach as well. So for this, I will actually just try to eyeball the kind of, it's the wrong line. I'll just try to eyeball the angle of this pedestal. And we keep in mind that low point should actually intersect with the angle here should actually intersect with the lowest point over here somewhere. So just, you know, eyeball that, and then we can actually go and measure. If this angle is looking nice, then we can just go on here and measure the actual distance. All right, so now we have a little bit more information on there. Let's work on something over here. So this mark was this intersecting point over here, so we can maybe next look for this point. Remember, this angle matters, so try to, you know, see it in your eye and then just take a guess. You know, the string isn't, you know, very accurate when you put things down here and then you have to guess. So what I recommend is, now you have a mark, you remeasure, you go back there, and then you can see, you know, how much from your mark is the actual distance. So I can see, you know, the distance between the new mark and this should be around, let's say, 2 millimeters. And yeah, we just put it down, and okay, we're good with that. If this feels tricky at first, you just keep doing it, and that way you can start getting a feel for it as well. And it's better to, you know, double, triple, quadruple check the marks than start second guessing later. So now we have 3 points over here, and here comes the very useful technique we can call maybe triangulation. We measured from here to here, and now we want to measure also from this point to this point. So if this distance matches what we have put down, that means the angle was correct. Maybe I was a little bit too high on there. So this is going to be a little bit hard to see because, you know, my hands and the string gets away. But now we can sort of have a situation where the X marks the spot. You know, we can imagine the string kind of moves at an arc like this. If you make a mark that is, you know, with the arc of the string, and then you measure from another spot with the arc of the string, then you will have a pretty precise spot where actually then you can just put something down, and that should be pretty good for, you know, a rough placement at least. So this was just done a little bit larger to demonstrate, but now we have this X over here that we can use. And we don't have to leave it as an X, but, you know, we can we can use that place later on. I recommend you do some of these spots first and then start connecting the lines, but maybe I'll just do something else first. You know, we don't want to leave this whole drawing as, you know, just a map of X's or dots and then start connecting the lines. That's not really the purpose. So maybe I'll just connect right here and just first use light straight lines. And you can leave them a little bit thicker. We don't mind that. We can then later on carve those out with the erasers and make them a little bit more accurate, a little bit more straight, nicer as we need to. But you know, we're just doing some rough placements now. All right, from here, I will just keep working and you will see the result. Also, just to mention, maybe you noticed or didn't, but you know, it was a while since I made this point over here. So I just, you know, took a little bit of time to remeasure that and just make sure I got it right in the first place. Yeah, I think that's pretty close. So I made sure this is right or correct, you know, the measurement holds up, because now I want to measure against this point as well when I'm checking this point. So that way, if this point was off, then, you know, I don't base something else off this point. We can kind of compound mistakes like that. So in the very early stages like this, just keep checking every point all the time. It's a bit tedious, it takes time, but you know, that's the best way to get a really accurate result. And I feel, you know, this does kind of start developing your eye for angles, for example. You can see some, if I look at this angle between these 2 points, maybe I can start comparing, you know, is this very off or a little bit off from what I was seeing earlier? Maybe it's a little bit more like this. And then by measuring from this point to this point, I can actually find the correct spot, because, you know, I make the mark again like this with the radius of the string. You know, this would draw a circle if I was to just swing it around. And so if I do another sort of radius from here, then we would have this X, and that's where the X ended up. Maybe it holds up to, you know, new measurements. We can check it again from this side. And it's pretty good. So it's looking wrong because, you know, this is obviously a kind of bulging form. You can't really draw a straight line over here, so we want to put down some more points before we make this side. But you know, maybe this is simplifiable into a straight line at this point, so let's just put it over there so we get something to look at. So yeah, now that I think about it, there is this kind of hollow bit over here where the trapezius kind of meets the, I don't know, scapular or whatever shoulder muscles are kind of popping out of here. So this is a point where I could measure to. You know, if you have a curve, it's kind of hard to decide which point is the point that I'm measuring against. So that is the problem that we face a lot. So, you know, that is why we try to find a solid point to measure to, and then we can simplify to straight lines, and then we can finally round those things off by eye, and we should end up with something nice to look at. Nice and accurate, let's say. And then we can measure against this point. So now, you know, let's just double check on this side that the distance is right. It seems pretty close, so now we can just actually simplify it into a straight line over here. And yeah, maybe we can just close out the form like this. So now we start having some kind of shape to look at. Like, obviously this is very simplified compared to this one. So maybe if we go for these kind of major breaks in the outline, let's say there's a point over there, here, this point over here, this point over here, both of these kind of breaks on here, well, maybe here, this angle break over here, these kind of points that, you know, have pretty distinct angle breaks. We can always measure pretty well to those, and what I recommend is generally try to put those down first, so you have something very, you know, visible, clear over here to look at, and then you can start connecting those. Maybe there's some smaller angle breaks, you know, in between that you can really grab onto, something like this where it's, you know, a pretty good amount is bulging out of the straight line simplification if we were to just do that. So maybe we want to add a point over there. So maybe we can turn this into two straight lines, one like this and another line going over like this. So we get something a little bit more accurate to look at. What we want to achieve is something similar to this, and this would be called the construct stage, where we want to, you know, pretty much with straight lines map out everything, including the shadow shapes at the end. But first we will work on the outline of the drawing. And next I will mainly just try to work at it and perhaps speed up the footage or show you the result, you know, the point I get to. So for the time being, I will just try to focus on working. Now, when we start to arrive at a point where we have, you know, some recognizable shapes that we can actually compare between these two images, we want to close one eye. For me, my right eye is the dominant eye. If I close my left eye, I go, you know, I try to place my right eye pretty much between these two projects, and then I just flick back and forth between these images, and we start to notice if there's, you know, any glaring discrepancies between these. Maybe what I notice then is that this point could be a little bit higher, you know, this angle kind of changes when I flick back and forth. We don't have to do this yet, but, you know, we want to train the eye as we're doing this whole project, so we want to try to pick up on any discrepancies between these two images, the drawing that is forming and the reference, you know, before we have to measure everything out and check that way, so that way we can actually learn by doing this as well. So here we have a situation where actually I was measuring this distance here, because to me it's looking a little bit off. For some reason this feels longer than this distance here. So now we actually can just go in with the string and actually make sure it is exactly the right distance. And maybe there's actually a millimeter or so that is too much width on this line, so we can just, you know, correct that. But measuring like this, you can actually really make sure your eye is just not lying to you. You know, we don't have to trust the feeling as much because, you know, we're not trained yet. We just want to get something accurate on the paper so we can actually compare and correct even more by eye. At the start, it's pretty difficult for a beginner to just do this whole thing by eye. Difficult being the maybe wrong word in this case. Overwhelming would be the better word. So this here is a kind of a vertical, so I'm just gonna toss it on there. Okay, when we're working with something like this, there's the outline over here. It's actually, you know, full of small kind of curves. There's no like extremely sharp angle break like this where we could pinpoint the measuring spot. We can just, because it's our print, maybe if you're using a shared one you can't do this, but we can just make a mark on there, you know. Then we have the precise spot we want to measure to. We can put in a very tiny dot, and that will work as a reference for the measuring in the future. There's a bunch of like small pixel-sized dots and flecks on this print out anyway, so you can use some of the imperfections you can find here. Like there's a little bit of a thicker spot on here on the line I could use for this measuring point, for example. Here there's also a small dot right there, which I can just emphasize and use that for my measuring spot. And these kind of things, just you can make use of the imperfections on this to create an even more accurate measurement for yourself. For measurements like this, where we are actually kind of far away from the point we are measuring and we are not going along with the contour being, you know, the outline over here, where it's more easy to see if, you know, it's more or less in the right spot. If we just measure a random point in here from here, then the next logical step would be, in my opinion, to measure from the plumb line, see if we have the width in the right ballpark, because, well, we try to take a horizontal measurement here and we see the width and placed on here. Seems I measured a little bit too wide, so let's just create a sort of width marker over here. Now this is the general width we want for this spot right here. And then we remeasure from this spot and we should arrive at a pretty accurate measurement. So where this width measurement intersects with our line measurement should be the right spot, which is right there. And now we can double triple check if we feel the need to, but I think visually it's looking pretty all right. You know, there's these relationships you can go for, look for, like this. The angle looks, you know, kind of all right to me. It's at least, you know, close enough for continuing on from here. Here you can see I'm just putting in a kind of a rough ghosty line, and then I can just refine it and make it a little bit straighter like this. We don't have to have anything, you know, permanent, very decisive at this stage. We just want to have something to look at. So we can, you know, in the next phase, we can start comparing these bigger shapes to each other, you know, to make sure we're actually pretty close to the right dimensions. Here with the left butt cheek, we can actually, I think we can get away with just a few extra spots we add here. I'm just making small kind of notches that go against the outline so I know where to measure from. So maybe I'll simplify it, you know, in a straight line, actually probably just over here and then here. So we have at least a kind of general shape for that. So if you've been watching this demonstration closely so far, you will notice I pretty much never just make one measurement and stick with that and move on. I will always make a measure, make a mark, check that mark. And if it's a tricky spot, well, in general, it is recommended to, you know, pick another, preferably another spot away from that initial measurement. For example, over here is a strong spot we can use for this measurement, and just double check that and make sure it's actually really good. So when you measure it like this, and okay, the string slipped a little bit, so keep that in mind as well. The string might slip in your fingers, so if you feel that happening, then just take another measurement. You can wrap the string around your fingers to try to prevent that a little bit. But yeah, try to sort of triangulate these points as well. You will get better results. So maybe the measurement from there is around here. And now we can triple double check that measurement over here. Let's see. Does it add up? No, it's a little bit long, so adjust and check. Yeah, so this is where you more or less end up. Now we can connect the dots again. So actually this whole thing can be pretty much just broken into one straight line over here. So I'm just going to do that. We will find the rest of the spots as well. Obviously this contour isn't a straight line, but now we have something, you know, large to look at, and you know, it's probably in the ballpark of being correct because we took our time with these measurements. And maybe this is still too rough to start mapping the shadows, but we should probably keep just refining the outline a little bit more. So when we arrive at a spot like this, where we're, you know, looking at this and comparing, maybe the first things we want to do is fix the glaringly obviously wrong or, you know, oversimplified areas. So maybe the first point to start with would be this, which is, you know, obviously breaking out of this straight line, and just start somewhere. Maybe don't go into very small undulations and details like this bump here, for example. We don't really need that to get any more information, but you know, this area is very simple, so let's just start there and we'll just inch our way towards a more accurate representation of what we're seeing here. While I'm measuring, I'm also trying to see where I initially placed the spot, so I'm not just entirely guessing. I just try to look for things like, you know, when I'm holding the string like this, over here as you see, I try to compare to previous spots like this here. So when I'm placing my point over here, I'm moving the string around and seeing if this sort of aligns with the spot I was placing before, so we can end up in the correct, you know, area, as opposed to placing a mark over here and it's way off, you know. We try to look for this kind of relationship between these two marks already, so we can get it, you know, within the millimeter to 2 millimeter range already of accuracy just with this single measurement. And then we naturally, you know, keep checking and cross-checking and placing these accurately. Trust me, this gets a lot faster when you first measure things out here, and then you can start, drawing a bit more freely. We keep measuring till the very end, of course, but checking things, but it gets way more easy to do that later on and less laborsome when we actually take our time over here. And now, since we corrected the contour of this section right here, we can now, make another simplification there, and we start seeing, the chest muscles pop out of the torso there. Since we started on this side, let's just erase the useless marks over here. We can just keep going down. Or if we see something obvious, like maybe this point over here, that kind of can be broken down into a straight line like this and this, maybe we can do that next. So we always just keep getting a bit closer to the final result. This again is a point where, we actually have something like this happening in there. We can't really pick, a nice angle break to use as our reference. So maybe we can, just make a little point there. That way we can maintain accurate measurements. And this should be, pretty close as a point, since we tried measuring it very precisely earlier. But, whenever possible, I recommend you use these strong points that we measured on the plumb line to measure pretty much, well, almost everything out first. Then you have something to trust, and then you can use other things to check that. Because if we happen to have measured this point right here, for example, wrong, and we use that to measure, then obviously any error in this, be it 0.5 millimeter or 2 millimeters, will transfer onto this point right here. So, everything measured from this point will be 2 millimeters off. And then if we use this point that we make using this one, that will also be a little bit off, and the error compounds, and in the end we measure really precisely and nicely, and still we end up with something that is not very great. So that's why we want to use these points that we actually use the ruler in the very start to measure pretty accurate points for us to compare against. Naturally, if you have created some very strong points with very clear breaks, like this point, for example, that could be a pretty strong point to measure against, as long as you took your time really making sure, measure from here to here, here to here, measure the width, make sure all of those are in line with each other, and then you could then start using this point to measure all the smaller things happening in here. But before you do that, you should really make sure the point you are using for measuring is correct, actually. At this point in the demo, I'm just going to start eyeballing things like there's a small angle, in here that is very close to the point where I'm measuring from. If my margin of error is like 0.5 millimeter or something, and I'm measuring a distance of like 3 to 4 millimeters, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to measure it, because I can probably get a bit closer just by eye at this point. So I recommend you keep measuring here. I'm just trying to save a bit of, my personal time. I'm not aiming for a perfect product here, but just to show you how it's done. We do still check those though, so now I check the width after eyeballing this, and it's pretty good. So now I know this isn't terribly exciting at this stage, but it's starting to form little by little, and this will save you a bit of time and hassle and frustration if you do this stage very, very meticulously and check things over and over again. And once you start, approaching the more fine refinements, you will thank yourself, because you don't have to second guess everything. And if you're wondering why I'm using this lower strong point for measuring all the time, it's mostly so that you can actually see what's happening, because my arm gets in the way if I use the higher point. So I'll just mostly use this for checking, or if it's, you know, very near to the point I'm measuring to. So when you reach this sort of stage where, you know, everything is kind of sort of in place, you know, this is a very rough sort of outline of this statue we're looking at. And now you can actually start comparing the widths and measurements a bit more visually as well. You can start looking for things like, you know, is this angle actually looking correct, since we have these 2 points marked out, and I feel like this is a bit more vertical as an angle as opposed to this one where it's, you know, pointing a little bit more towards, let's say, 2 o'clock. Well, this is around 1 o'clock, you know, on a clock where we have arrangements like this, you know, we have this is a very bad example, but you know, 12 o'clock is up, 1 is, you know, a little bit to the right, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so forth. So if I speak with these terms, then you know what I'm talking about. So yeah, back to that point. I actually fixed this point right here. I started questioning it because something felt off, and I realized this width was a bit too much in my drawing. So I checked that and moved this point and redrew the lines accordingly. And you know, doesn't take long. Just make sure you check these things. And in addition to using the string, you want to actually take a good look at your drawing and compare while you're doing this. That will help you out also in training your eye. And I mean, this isn't much to look at yet, but you know, once the one principle that always applies is that the more information we have, the more we have to compare to, and the better we can actually fix our drawing and values and all this kind of stuff. And this applies all the way to the still life stage. You know, if you have a single brush stroke in the middle of the canvas, you can't really tell if it's right or wrong. You have to compare it to other things around it. And yeah, so basically once we have the shadow shapes, we can start comparing those and the negative spaces between the shadow shapes, you know, widths between shadow shapes, all this kind of stuff to each other. And this will help us in checking our drawing. I'll just start getting rid of these little marks for the points that I've been making, so at least so they're not too distracting when I'm looking at the image. So Don't have to get fully rid of them, just, you know, make them at least a little bit lighter. So and as I'm sort of moving into a little bit more accuracy, checking things, fixing smaller things. This is not yet the articulation stage, which would be like finding the actually really accurate outline. But I start taking care more with the points I'm measuring and checking, where I, you know, use more of a point rather than some vague line to measure these things out. I don't know if it's visible actually on the camera, but you know, I use a very specific like small mark of the tip of the pencil for the mark I'm using here. Okay, before we start refining the outline any more than this, I think it's a good place to start mapping out some major points on the shadow shapes and the inside information of the drawing. That'll also help us place the, you know, finer things of the outline later on. If you want, you know, there's more points we could find. For example, you know, this one right here, it kind of defines this angle break over here. You know, maybe smaller things, but we don't really need those for this stage yet, so we can just move along. And what we want to be looking for again is very strong points that are easily visible. For example, this angle break right here is a good point, and we get a lot of information from it. Other examples could be something like, you know, this line over here, we then kind of get a nice new shape to compare to other things. This line over here, we can define this whole light shape and then start comparing, seeing if it's too wide or narrow or whatnot. Maybe this kind of edge of the shadow here creates a very strong, almost like right angle